Regency, England, where a signature costs a soul. She never imagined that one piece of paper would bind her to the predator in the boardroom. Miss Clementina Cleo Roke, of high birth but destitute circumstances, stood in the lion's den to face her only creditor, the Duke of Wilder. But Percival St. Clair did not want her money. He offered a chilling ultimatum, her womb for his forgiveness, an heir to erase a lifetime of debt. She accepted, believing she was entering a prison. She was wrong, because what began as a cold calculation became an obsession that would bring the iced Duke to his knees. The silence in the room was louder than a scream. A piece of parchment trembled in the air, held on one side by a manicured strong hand, and on the other by a lace-cuff hand shaking with terror. "Hey there, before we see if Cleo signs her life away. Quick pause. My granny says if I get 1,000 subscribers this week, the algorithm will finally share my stories with the world, and she'll stop haunting my dreams about it. So, do a good deed for Granny. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? London? New York? Or somewhere tropical? Let's get back to the scandal. The study of Wilder House smelled of old leather and expensive tobacco, the scent of power. Percival St. Clair stood by the fireplace, the firelight catching the gray in his dark beard, looking every inch the predator his reputation suggested. Across from him, Cleo clutched her dark blue serge gown, as if it were armor, her sapphire eyes wide against the gloom. Outside, the London rain lashed against the glass, much like the panic beating against her ribs. The debt slip lay between them, the sum written in ink that seemed to burn. It was impossible, grotesque, a mountain of ruin built by her late father's reckless investments. He had gambled away their security with the same casual indifference he had shown his family. And now, his ghost had left Cleo to pay the price. "The terms are simple, Miss Roke," Percy said, his voice articulate and terrifyingly cold. "I do not require your conversation to block my cousin from the title. I only require your womb. Give me a son, and this debt turns to ash." Cleo's aristocratic bone structure tightened. She was cornered, educated enough to know she had no rights, but proud enough to hate him for it. She would not beg, but God, she was terrified. But as Cleo reached the quill to sign away her freedom, she noticed something that made her breath hitch. The Duke's hand wasn't just holding the paper. It was trembling ever so slightly. Was it anger? Or was there a darker, hungrier reason he had chosen her specifically out of all the women in London? Wilder House was not a home. It was a fortress of gray stone that seemed to swallow the light of the waning afternoon. As the heavy oak doors groaned open, Cleo stepped into a foyer that smelled of beeswax and fear. A line of servants stood rigid against the paneled walls, their eyes fixed on the floor, their hands clasped behind their backs. They were not bowing out of respect. They were cowering. The air in the house was so still it felt brittle, as if a single wrong word might shatter the peace. And the source of their terror stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at her like a hawk assessing a field mouse. Percival St. Clair descended slowly, his movements deliberate and silent. His severe black frock coat was buttoned to the chin, a suit of armor that barely contained the breadth of his shoulders, while the rich purple of his cravat offered the only hint of color in his stark existence. Up close, the silver in his beard caught the gaslight, giving him the look of a seasoned warrior rather than a peer of the realm. He did not offer his hand. He did not offer a welcome. He simply turned and walked toward the east wing, expecting her to follow. "The rules are absolute, Miss Roke," he said, his voice echoing off the marble floors. "You are not a guest. You are an investment. You will not leave the grounds. You will not correspond with the outside world without my censorship. You will dine with me. You will walk where I tell you to walk, and you will remain available to me at all times." Cleo hurried to keep pace, her boots clicking sharply on the stone. She clutched her skirts, her knuckles white. "Am I a prisoner then, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart against her ribs. Percy stopped abruptly, turning to pin her with that sapphire dark gaze. You are the vessel of my legacy, he corrected, his manicured fingers twitching at his side as if he wanted to reach out but restrained himself. Until the debt is paid in flesh and blood, you belong to Wilder House. And I am Wilder House. He gestured to a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. Your quarters. Dinner's at 8. Do not be late. Cleo watched him walk away, his stride eating up the distance, before she retreated into the room. It was magnificent. Velvet drapes the color of wine, a 4-poster bed large enough for an army, and a fire roaring in the hearth. It was a gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating. She moved to close the door, needing a moment to breathe, to compose the mask of indifference she wore to protect her pride. She gripped the brass handle and turned it, intending to slide the bolt home and secure her safety for at least a few hours. Her breath hitched. The wood was smooth. There was no bolt. There was no keyhole. There was no lock on the inside. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. Before she could step away, the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps echoed from the hallway, getting louder, getting closer, and stopping precisely on the other side of the wood. The handle turned with agonizing slowness that made Cleo's breath catch in her throat. When the door swung open, Percy filled the frame, casting a long shadow across the velvet carpet. He had discarded his severe frock coat, leaving him in a crisp white shirt and dark waistcoat that did little to hide the tension coiling in his muscles. Cleo stood by the hearth, clutching her dressing gown, bracing herself for the cold indifference of a business transaction, or worse, the callous taking of what he believed he had bought. He closed the door and locked it, a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot. He crossed the room not with the swagger of a conqueror, but with the grim determination of a man walking to the gallows. When he stopped before her, the scent of sandalwood and brandy overwhelmed the room. He reached out and Cleo flinched, closing her eyes tight. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice rougher than she had heard it in the study. She opened her eyes to find him staring at her, his hand hovering near her cheek. "I am not a monster, Clementina. I do not take what is not yielded." He did not wait for an answer. His hands, those manicured, strong hands she feared, cupped her face with a startling heat. He kissed her, and it was not the clinical seal of a contract she had expected. It was a collision. His lips were demanding, hungry, stripping away her defenses with proficiency that left her dizzy. When he lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed, the ice duke seemed to melt, replaced by something far more volatile. As she lay back, her raven hair fanning out against the pristine white pillows, Percy froze. He hovered over her, his breathing ragged, his sapphire eyes tracing the contrast of her dark curls against the linen. For a moment, the mask slipped. The calculating predator vanished, leaving a man who looked almost pained by her beauty. "This was a mistake," he muttered, though he did not pull away. The act that followed was a blur of friction and fire. It was supposed to be a duty, a sterile requirement for an heir, but the chemistry between them sparked a blaze that neither could control. Cleo found herself arching into his touch, her own hands gripping his shoulders, betraying her resolve to remain detached. He possessed her with a focused intensity that bordered on worship, driving them both to a shuddering precipice that left the air in the room charged and heavy. Then, as quickly as the storm had broken, the cold returned. Percy pulled away, his face closing up like a shuttered window. He dressed in silence, refusing to meet her gaze, his rigid self-control slamming back into place. Without a word, he turned and marched out of the room, leaving Cleo trembling and confused in the tangled sheets. She rolled over, her heart still hammering against her ribs, trying to reconcile the cold businessman with the passionate lover who had just unraveled in her arms. As she reached for a glass of water on the nightstand, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic. It wasn't hers. It was a small silver locket, ancient and tarnished. Cleo picked it up, her fingers trembling. It seemed impossible that the impeccable Duke would leave behind such a worn trinket. Curious, she pried it open. Inside, there was no miniature portrait of a lover or a child. There was only a lock of hair, blonde and fine, and a tiny inscription scratched into the metal. For the heart I buried. November bled into December, bringing with a frost that settled over the Wilder estate, mirroring the chill that permeated the halls. The routine of their lives had calcified into a strange, suffocating rhythm. By day, Cleo was the ghost of the manor, wandering the endless corridors under the watchful eyes of staff. By night, she was the Duke's conquest. Yet, it was the evenings that unnerved her most. They sat at opposite ends of a mahogany table long enough to seat 20, the silence broken only by the scrape of silver against china. Percy did not eat. He drank his wine, a deep blood-red vintage, and he watched her. His gaze was physical, a weight she could feel pressing against her skin. It was the look of a miser counting his gold, manic and possessive. When she lifted her glass, his eyes tracked the movement of her throat. When she shifted in her chair, his jaw tightened. "I wish to walk to the village tomorrow," Cleo announced, her voice sounding small in the cavernous room. "I require fresh air beyond the garden walls." Percy set his glass down. The sound was sharp. "No, I am not a prisoner, Percival." "You carry my potential air," he countered, his voice low and vibrating with that dangerous, restrained energy. "You are the most valuable asset in England. You do not leave the gates. You do not risk a fall, a chill, or a carriage accident. You stay where I can see you." Cleo felt the invisible noose of his obsession tightening, suffocating as the silk cravats he wore. "So I am to be a broodmare with a library card," she snapped, abandoning propriety. "You confuse protection with ownership, Your Grace." Rousseau argued that man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. "I did not realize he was speaking specifically of your wife." Percy blinked, the cold mask slipping. He stood and moved toward her, not with menace, but with a sudden, stalking interest. He stopped beside her chair, looming over her. "You read Rousseau?" "I read everything," Cleo challenged, tilting her head back to meet his sapphire glare. "Did you think poverty erased my education? I know that a contract signed under duress is morally bankrupt, regardless of its legality." Percy stared at her, and for the first time, the hunger in his eyes wasn't just for her body. It was for the fire in her mind. A flush crept up his neck, betraying him. "You have a sharp tongue. Clementina," he murmured, his thumb grazing her jawline. "I find I do not want to dull it." The air between them crackled, the intellectual spar acting as a more potent aphrodisiac than touch. He left her then, retreating to his study before his control snapped entirely. Cleo let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, feeling a strange thrill of having pierced his armor. The next morning, however, the fragile equilibrium shattered. Cleo sat in the morning room when the butler entered, looking pale. He carried a silver tray with a single letter resting upon it. "For you, miss," he whispered, glancing nervously toward the door as if fearing the Duke's arrival. Cleo frowned. She had no friends who knew where she was. Percy had ensured her isolation was absolute. She picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, and smelled faintly of cloying perfume. But it was the wax seal that made her blood run cold. It didn't bear the Wilder crest. It bore the crest of the cadet branch of the St. Clair family. It was from Lord Silas, the cousin Percy despised, the man whose inheritance she was being used to steal. And as she broke the seal, she realized Silas knew exactly where she was, and exactly what she was doing. The truth revealed itself not with fanfare, but with the violent retching that seized Cleo before the sun had even crested the horizon. By the time Dr. Edmund snapped his medical bag shut and offered a stiff nod of confirmation, Cleo felt a strange cocktail of triumph and terror. She was with child. The air existed. The chain was broken. She found Percy in the library, staring into the dying embers of the fire. When she announced the news, she expected relief, perhaps a cold acknowledgement of a transaction completed. Instead, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Percy turned slowly, his face unreadable, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. He did not ask about her health. He did not ask about the gender. He simply crossed the room in 3 long strides and gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into the blue serge of her gown. "You are certain?" he demanded, his voice rough. "The doctor is certain," Cleo replied, stepping back to break his hold. "Which means, Your Grace, that our contract is fulfilled. The debt is paid. I shall make arrangements to move to the dower house until the child is born, as we discuss." No, the word was a wall of stone. Cleo stiffened. "Beg your pardon? You will not leave this house." Percy's eyes were wild, darting over her face as if memorizing every pore. "The winter roads are treacherous. The dower house is drafty. You are carrying the future of this dukedom, Clementina. I will not risk you." "You mean you will not risk the heir," she corrected, anger flaring. "I mean I will not risk you," he roared, the sound shattering his composure. He loomed over her, the predator fully awakened. "You think you can simply walk away? You think this ends because a ledger is balanced?" Percy's eyes went dark, staring right through the scene, staring right at you. "You think you can just watch without commitment? Fate punishes those who take without giving. If you don't subscribe right now, you might find yourself in a debt you can never pay off, alone in the dark. Don't risk the bad luck. Click subscribe before the candle blows out." He stepped back, his chest heaving, reasserting his control with visible effort. "You remain here. For your health. That is a final." He stormed out, locking the library door from the outside, a symbolic gesture that chilled her to the bone. Cleo was shaking. He wasn't letting her go. Later that evening, the heavy oak doors of the study were left slightly ajar. Cleo, walking softly in her stocking feet, paused as she heard the low murmur of Percy's solicitor, Mr. Thaddeus. "The child secures a title, Your Grace." The lawyer's dry voice drifted into the hall. "But once the infant is delivered, Miss Roke will expect her freedom." "Let her expect it," Percy's voice answered, dark and possessive, sending a shiver down Cleo's spine. "Draft a revision to the custody clause. Find a loophole in the Marriage Act. I don't care what it costs. Thaddeus, the child stays. And so does she. I have no intention of ever letting her walk out those doors." To quell the rising whispers about his recluse behavior, Percy ordered a masquerade ball, a spectacle of silk and deception that transformed Wilder House into a theater of the absurd. Cleo stood near the edge of the ballroom, her hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her abdomen, concealed beneath the empire waist of her emerald gown. She felt exposed, a secret on display, watching the masked gentry dance while a man who owned her prowled the perimeter, his eyes never leaving her. She retreated to the relative safety of the terrace, craving the bite of the winter air over the suffocating heat of the ballroom. But the shadows here were not empty. "A lovely night for a scandal, isn't it?" The voice was like oil slicked over gravel. Cleo spun around to find a man stepping from the darkness. He removed his mask, revealing a face that was a twisted mirror of Percy's, handsome, but marred by a cruel, sensual mouth and eyes devoid of soul. Lord Silas St. Clair. "You should not be here," Cleo hissed, backing against the stone balustrade. Silas stepped closer, his gaze dropping deliberately to her stomach. "And you should not be breeding, my dear Miss Roke. At least, not for a price." He smirked, closing the distance until she could smell the gin on his breath. "Everyone wonders who the mother is. Imagine the thrill when I tell the Times that the future Duke is nothing but a bastard purchased from a desperate debtor. You're not a duchess, Clementina. You're a whore with a receipt." He reached out, his fingers grazing her arm. Before Cleo could scream, a blur of black motion collided with Silas. It was Percy. The calculated restraint that defined the Duke of Wilder evaporated in a terrifying instant. He didn't challenge his cousin to a duel. He didn't call for the guards. He tackled Silas into the stone railing with a primal roar. Percy's fist connected with Silas's jaw, a sickening crack that silenced the nearby guests. The Duke, whose hands had never known manual labor, pounded his cousin's face with a violence that spoke of months of suppressed rage. He was destroying the threat, dirtying his manicured hands with his own blood and Silas's. "Get up!" Percy snarled, grabbing Silas by the lapels, his chest heaving, his eyes black with murder. "Touch her again, and I will tear you apart." Silas slumped against the balustrade, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the pristine terrace stones. But he didn't cower. He looked up at Percy, his swollen lip curling into a grotesque smile. He laughed, a wet, gurgling sound that sent a chill through the heat of Percy's rage. "You can beat me, cousin," Silas wheezed, wiping the blood from his chin. "You can kill me, but you can't stop what I've already put in motion. Go ahead." Check the nursery. The nursery was empty. Silas's threat had been a cruel distraction, a psychological blade twisted in their ribs. But the message was clear. As long as Clementina remained, the child she carried was a target. She stood in the center of the silent room, her hand resting on the empty crib, listening to the distant chaos of the ball being dismantled. The scandal Silas threatened would destroy Percy. It would brand their child a bastard born of a sordid transaction. There was only one way to sanitize the lineage. She had to disappear. Cleo returned to her chambers, her movements mechanical, stripping away the emerald silk and the jewels Percy had draped her in. She pulled the old blue serge gown from the back of the wardrobe. It smelled of lavender and poverty, a stark reminder of the woman she had been when she walked into this house. Buttoning, it felt like donning mourning weeds. She was not fleeing a prison anymore. She was exiling herself in the only home she had ever truly known. She sat at the writing desk, the very place where she had once tried to outwit him with Rousseau. The quill felt heavy as lead. She did not write of love. She could not afford the luxury of sentiment that might tempt him to follow. She kept it cold, precise, the language of the contract he had forced upon her. The debt is paid. The heir is yours. I am gone. She placed the paper on his pillow, weighted down by the silver locket she had found months ago. The service entrance was unguarded, the staff distracted by the aftermath of the Duke's brawl. Cleo slipped into the London night, the rain instantly soaking through the thin fabric of her serge gown, chilling her to the marrow. She did not look back at the imposing silhouette of Wilder House. If she looked, she would crumble. She climbed into the hired hackney carriage she had signaled from the street, the interior smelling of damp straw and misery. "Drive," she whispered to Jarvey. "Anywhere but here." The carriage lurched forward, the wheels grinding against the cobblestones. Cleo leaned her head against the cold glass, closing her eyes as the tears finally came, hot and fast. She had saved him. She had saved the child. It was done, but she was wrong. As the carriage rattled away into the fog, disappearing into the labyrinth of London streets, the iron gates of Wilder House burst open. A massive black stallion thundered out into the storm, its rider heedless of the slick pavement or the dangerous dark. The figure did not wear a coat or a hat to shield him from the deluge. He rode with the manic desperation a man possessed, driving his mount hard enough to kill it, his eyes fixed on the faint tracks in the mud that led away from his heart. The boarding house on the edge of Cheapside smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. In a room barely large enough to contain the iron bed frame, Cleo burned. The rain that had soaked her blue serge gown during her flight had seeped deeper than her skin, planting a fever that now raged through her blood with terrifying ferocity. She tossed on the lumpy mattress, the sheets damp with sweat, her mind trapped in a delirium where the ceiling cracks morphed into the intricate plasterwork of Wilder House. "Percy," she whispered, the name cracking her dry lips. "Don't let him find me. Don't let him know." But her body had betrayed her in the cruelest way possible. The cramping that had started as a dull ache was now a jagged knife twisting in her lower back. It was too soon. She was only 7 months along. The stress, the exposure, the grief. It was forcing the heir into the world before he was ready. Mrs. Gamp, the landlady, had summoned a physician not out of kindness, but out of fear that a woman dying in her rental would attract the magistrate. The doctor was a small, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and breath that smelled of gin. He moved around the cramped room with a grim efficiency, his face growing paler with every minute that passed. Outside, the city of London was being torn apart. Percival St. Clair was no longer a man. He was a natural disaster. He had spent the last 48 hours systematically dismantling the criminal underworld, bribing Jarvies, threatening innkeepers, and overturning the city's stones with the manic desperation of a creature who had lost its mate. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He had simply hunted, his fortune flowing like water into the hands of anyone who had seen a woman with midnight hair and sapphire eyes. Inside the room, a scream tore from Cleo's throat as a contraction seized her, bending her body like a bow. She was fading. The fire in her blood was dimming to cold ash. She could feel the life slipping from her fingers, the darkness at the edges of her vision creeping closer. The doctor wiped his brow with a grimy handkerchief and turned to the landlady, his voice low and defeated. He looked down at the pale, sweating-formed woman on the bed, her breathing shallow and ragged. "The fever is too high, and the labor is too far advanced," the doctor whispered, shaking his head. "I can save the child, perhaps, but the mother is fading fast. She will not survive the hour." Just as the last syllable left his lips, the front door of the boarding house didn't just open. It exploded inward. The wood splintered with a violence that shook the floorboards, kicked off its hinges by a boot that carried the weight of a duke's wrath. Percival St. Clair stood in the wreckage of the doorway, filling the small room with a terrifying energy. The immaculate Duke of Wilder was gone. In his place was a man unraveled. His cravat hung loose around his neck. His shirt was stained with the mud of the London streets, and his dark beard was wild and unkempt. His chest heaved as his frantic gaze swept the room, landing instantly on the frail figure in the bed. "Out!" He snarled at the doctor and Mrs. Gamp. He didn't look at them, but the command was so lethal that the physician grabbed his bag and fled, without a word. Percy collapsed to his knees beside the iron bed frame, ignoring the filth on the floor. He took Cleo's burning hand in his grip desperate, trembling. "Clementina," he choked out, the name tearing from his throat like a plea. "Open your eyes. I command you to open your eyes." She didn't move. Her skin was gray, her breathing a shallow rattle that terrified him more than any silence. The Ice Duke, the man who controlled empires and crushed rivals with a signature, finally cracked. Tears, hot and foreign, spilled from his sapphire eyes, dripping onto her hand. "You cannot leave me," he whispered, pressing her palm against his bearded cheek. "The contract! It was a lie, Cleo. It was all a lie." He leaned closer, his voice breaking. "I need an heir. I could have disinherited Silas a dozen other ways. I needed you. I saw you in the park 3 years ago, proud and beautiful in your mended dress, and I was obsessed. I bought your father's debt solely to bring you to my door, to trap you." He buried his face in the curve of her neck, sobbing openly now, stripped of all pride. "I thought if I bound you to me with law and debt, I could make you mine. But I was a fool. I don't want the boy, Cleo. I don't care about the legacy. If you die, I will burn Wilder House to ground. I will end the line myself. Just breathe. Please, my love, just breathe." Cleo's eyelashes fluttered. The darkness that had been pulling her under receded for a heartbeat, chased away by the agony in his voice. She forced her heavy lids open. Her vision was blurred, swimming in shadows, but she saw him. She saw the tears in his beard. She heard the confession that shattered the world she thought she knew. He loved her. It hadn't been a transaction. She tried to squeeze his hand, tried to speak, but her strength was gone. As she looked past his weeping form, her gaze drifted to the solitary tallow candle on the bedside table. The flame danced violently in the draught from the broken door, sputtered once, and then, with a final wisp of smoke, vanished into the dark. The darkness did not claim her. When Cleo finally drifted back to the surface of consciousness, the smell of boiled cabbage was gone, replaced by the familiar scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. She opened her eyes to see the canopy of the master bed at Wilder House, and beside her, a crib carved from mahogany. Percy sat in the chair, no longer the unkempt madman of Cheapside, but restored to his immaculate grandeur, save for the way he held the tiny bundle in his arms. The Ice Duke was rocking gently, whispering soft nonsense to the son who had arrived amidst the storm, small but fighting with the St. Clair stubbornness. When he saw Cleo awake, the relief that washed over his face could have powered the sun. "He is perfect," Percy whispered, placing the sleeping infant into her arms. "And you stayed." He reached into his breast pocket, but instead of the cold ledger that had haunted them, he pulled out the crumpled, stained slip of debt. Without breaking eye contact, he held it over the bedside candle. They watched in silence as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The transaction was dead. In its place, he produced a fresh parchment, a special license from the Archbishop. "I do not want a debtor, Clementina. I want a wife. I want the woman who reads Rousseau and challenges my soul. They survive because they refuse to let go, because they committed to the fire rather than the cold. And speaking of commitment, look at where you are standing. They survive because they committed to each other. Are you committed to this channel? If you leave now without subscribing, you are walking away from the family just like the villainous cousin. Don't be a villain. Subscribe now. And if you refuse, go to the comments and tell me exactly why you choose to break my heart today." The wedding was small, held in the private chapel, but was vibrant with a joy that Wilder House had never known. Percy, the man who had once claimed to need nothing but an heir, stood at the altar with wet eyes as he pledged his life to the woman who had thawed his frozen heart. Years later, on a rainy afternoon, the Duke was rummaging through an old lockbox when his fingers brushed against the charred remains of the original contract, which he had saved in a glass vial as a memento. Beside it lay a scrap of paper. The original draft Cleo had reviewed that first day. He smiled, intending to discard the draft, when he flipped it over. There, in Cleo's elegant script, dated the very day they met in his study, was a single line written before she had even signed her name. Percy's breath hitched as he read the words. She hadn't signed the contract out of fear or even duty. She had signed it because she had recognized him from a ball 3 years prior, the lonely man in the shadows she had loved from afar. The note read simply, "I would have given him everything for free.